Jonathan Roumie was invited to meet Sean Combs. Diddy spotted him and walked over, extending his hand. "Jonathan, thank you for coming." "It's my pleasure, Mr. Combs," Jonathan said, shaking his hand firmly. "Please, call me Sean," he said, sitting down across from Jonathan. "I've been watching your portrayal of Jesus. It's different from what I expected." Jonathan nodded, unsure where this was heading. "Different in what way?" "More human," Sean said simply. "More real." They ordered coffee, and Jonathan waited for Sean to explain why he had arranged this meeting. After a few sips of his drink, Sean leaned forward. "I grew up in the church," he began, "but I've always looked at the world through the lens of business, entertainment, building brands. Faith was there, but it wasn't driving my decisions." Jonathan nodded, letting him continue. "But lately, I've been thinking about bigger questions. The kind that success doesn't have easy answers for." Sean looked down at his coffee. "Why are we here? What's the point of all this achievement if there's no greater purpose?" Jonathan felt his heart rate increase. Was Sean Combs about to discuss spirituality with him because he played Jesus on TV? "I'm not the right person to," Jonathan started. "You're exactly the right person," Sean interrupted. "You've spent years thinking about how Jesus would speak, how he would respond to questions. I'm not asking you as a theologian. I'm asking you as someone who's tried to understand the mind of Jesus." Jonathan took a deep breath. "What exactly are you asking me, Sean?" Sean's eyes met his with unexpected vulnerability. "I want to know what Jesus would think of what I'm trying to do. Would he see value in my work, or would he think I'm missing the point entirely?" Jonathan sat very still, processing Sean's question. This wasn't what he had anticipated at all. He'd prepared for questions about his acting process, or perhaps Sean wanting to invest in faith-based entertainment. But this was personal. Deeply personal. "That's a big question," Jonathan finally said. "I know," Sean nodded. "And maybe it's unfair to put you on the spot like this. But I've been watching interviews where you talk about how playing Jesus has affected your own faith. You seem to have insight I can't find elsewhere." Jonathan considered his words carefully. "When I prepare for scenes in The Chosen, I spend hours thinking about Jesus' perspective. Not just what he might say, but why he would say it. I try to understand his heart." "And what have you learned?" Sean asked, his usual confidence replaced by genuine curiosity. "That Jesus cared about people more than projects or achievements. That his measure of success was completely different from ours," Jonathan replied. "He valued compassion over competition, relationship over results." Sean frowned slightly. "So you're saying he would disapprove of building businesses, advancing entertainment?" "Not at all," Jonathan shook his head. "But I think he would ask about the why behind it. Are we improving lives because we value those lives, or just to prove we can do it?" Sean stared out the window for a moment. "I've always believed that uplifting Black culture and creating opportunities for my community is the most important goal. Building platforms for artists, developing businesses that create generational wealth, showing young people what's possible. These are all ways to ensure we thrive." "Those are noble goals," Jonathan agreed. "But Jesus might ask if we're remembering to love each other in the present while building for that future." The coffee shop had emptied now. They were alone except for the barista, who was busy cleaning equipment and didn't seem to be paying attention to their conversation. "I had a moment last week," Sean said suddenly. "I was reviewing plans for a new media venture. Something that could dramatically impact how our stories are told globally. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt empty." "Empty how?" Jonathan asked gently. "Like I was solving problems without understanding what they're for. Building platforms, but to what end? So we can create more, influence more, know more?" Sean shook his head. It started to feel circular. "We achieve to survive, we survive to achieve." Jonathan leaned forward. "Jesus talked a lot about purpose. Not just surviving, but living abundantly." "That's what I want to ask you about," Sean said, his voice lower now. "In your research, your preparation, what did you find that Jesus said about purpose? About why we're here?" Jonathan took a deep breath. He'd had theological discussions before, but never one that felt so consequential. He said he came so that people could have life more abundantly. Not just existence, but fullness. Fullness of what? Sean pressed. Of love, of connection, of meaning. Jonathan paused. Jesus didn't talk much about achievements. He talked about relationships. With God, with each other. Sean nodded slowly. That's where my thinking has been heading lately. All this success, all this influence, it feels hollow if it's not serving a deeper purpose. If it's not connecting us rather than isolating us. Jonathan wasn't sure how to respond. He hadn't expected this level of philosophical reflection from the music mogul. I have something to show you, Sean said suddenly. Something I've never shared publicly. Could you come with me? 20 minutes later, they were driving in Sean's car. Jonathan had expected a driver, but Sean was behind the wheel himself. They headed out of the city, neither speaking much during the journey. Jonathan wondered where they were going and what Sean wanted to show him. Finally, they turned onto a private road that led to what looked like an ordinary warehouse. Sean parked and led Jonathan to a side entrance, punching a code into a keypad. What I'm about to show you isn't secret exactly, Sean explained as they walked down a hallway, but I haven't talked about it publicly because I'm still working through what it means. He opened a door at the end of the corridor and they entered a large open space. It wasn't what Jonathan expected from a music mogul's private project. Instead of recording equipment or business offices, the room was filled with art, paintings of various sizes covering the walls. You paint? Jonathan asked, surprised. Sean nodded. I started during a particularly difficult period a few years ago. It was just a way to process thoughts that couldn't be solved with business plans or creative meetings. Jonathan moved closer to examine the paintings. They were abstract but evocative, swirls of color that somehow conveyed powerful emotions. Some felt chaotic and dark, others peaceful and luminous. These are remarkable, Jonathan said honestly. I had no idea you were an artist. I'm not really, Sean said. Not in any trained sense. But these helped me work through questions I couldn't answer any other way. He led Jonathan to the far wall where a series of paintings hung together. Unlike the others, these depicted recognizable scenes: a night sky over a city, a child looking up at stage lights, a hand reaching toward light. I painted these over the last 6 months, Sean explained, during the same time I've been watching The Chosen. Jonathan looked closely at one painting that showed a figure standing alone on a stage, facing a brilliant audience. There was something about the posture of the figure, a mixture of strength and surrender, that moved him deeply. What questions were you working through? Jonathan asked softly. Sean was quiet for a long moment. I've spent my life solving creative problems. How to make artists successful. How to build brands that last. How to create cultural movements. He gestured around the room. But none of that addresses the questions that keep me awake at night. Why are we here? What makes a life well lived? If consciousness is just a biochemical phenomenon, why does beauty move us? Why does love matter? Jonathan nodded, understanding. These aren't business questions. No, Sean agreed. They're the questions I've been avoiding because they don't yield to the same methods that have worked for everything else in my life. He walked to a canvas in the corner, still covered with a cloth. This is the last one I painted. I finished it the night before I contacted you. Slowly, he pulled the cloth away. The painting showed 2 figures, one clearly in modern clothes, the other in what appeared to be ancient robes. They sat together on a bench overlooking a vast landscape. The faces weren't detailed, but the sense of conversation, of connection between them, was powerful. I had a dream, Sean said quietly. I was sitting with Jesus, not as a religious figure, just as someone who understood something I needed to know. We talked all night, but when I woke up, I couldn't remember what he said, just how it felt. How did it feel? Jonathan asked. Sean looked at him directly. Like everything I've been doing has meaning. Not like all the questions have answers, but not the kind I've been trained to look for. Jonathan felt a shiver run through him. There was such earnestness in Sean's voice, such genuine searching. After that dream, Sean continued, I started researching, trying to understand the historical Jesus beyond the religious framework. That's when I found your show and your interviews about playing the role. He turned back to the painting. What would Jesus say about my work? Jonathan? Not just my companies, but my questions, my search? They sat on simple chairs in the middle of the art studio. Jonathan was still processing everything Sean had shared, the paintings, the dream, the questions that clearly tormented him despite his remarkable achievements. I'm not a theologian, Jonathan began carefully, and even as someone who plays Jesus on screen, I don't claim to know exactly what he would say to you personally. Sean nodded, waiting. But based on what I've studied, what I believe, Jonathan continued, I think Jesus would see your work differently than you might expect. He wouldn't focus on the business itself, but on the heart behind it. What do you mean? Sean asked. Jesus was constantly looking past what people did to why they did it. He praised a poor woman who gave a tiny amount of money because she gave from a generous heart. He criticized religious leaders who prayed impressively in public but only wanted to look good. Jonathan leaned forward. When I look at your work, trying to uplift your community, creating opportunities for artists, building platforms for underrepresented voices, I see someone trying to solve human problems, to reduce suffering, to create possibility. But is that enough? Sean asked. There was vulnerability in his voice that Jonathan had never heard in any interview or public appearance. Sometimes I worry that I'm just building modern towers of Babel, impressive achievements that ultimately miss the point of existence entirely. Jonathan considered this. There's a moment in Scripture where Jesus is asked about the greatest commandment. He says it's to love God, and the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else hangs on these. Sean was silent, absorbing this. The question isn't whether building businesses or creating entertainment is inherently meaningful, Jonathan continued. It's whether these things are expressions of love. Love for humanity, love for creation, love for the future generations who will inherit what we leave behind. Sean stood up and walked to one of his paintings, a dark canvas with a single point of light in the center. When I started my companies, I was driven by problems that needed solving. Lack of representation, limited opportunities for my community, barriers to success. Later, I started seeing bigger connections, that all these separate problems were really one problem, ensuring our voices continue to be heard. He turned back to Jonathan. But lately, I've been wondering if survival of our voices is enough. What kind of message are we fighting to preserve? What makes it worth preserving? That, Jonathan said quietly, is exactly the kind of question Jesus addressed. Not how to be heard longer, but how to speak well. Not just surviving, but becoming more fully human. And what did he say makes a life well lived? Sean asked. Love, Jonathan answered simply. Not just romantic love or family love, but the kind of love that sees the value in every person. That works for justice. That forgives enemies. That creates community instead of division. Sean walked to the window, looking out at the afternoon sun. I've been thinking about Jesus' teachings on wealth. I know he said difficult things about rich men and heaven. Jonathan nodded. He did, but I don't think it was wealth itself he was concerned about. It was how wealth can become an identity, a security blanket that replaces trust in God or genuine connection with others. Sean turned back, his expression intense. I said something in an interview once, that having money isn't necessarily about consuming things, but about the ability to make things happen, to solve problems. That sounds like stewardship, Jonathan observed, using what you have for purposes beyond yourself. Is that what Jesus would call it? Sean asked. I think so, Jonathan nodded. Jesus talked about talents, resources entrusted to people who were expected to use them well, not bury them in fear. There was a new energy in Sean's movements now. He walked back to the main painting, the one showing two figures in conversation. I want to tell you what happened in that dream, he said, what I remember feeling, even if the words are gone. In the dream, Sean began, Jesus and I were sitting somewhere high up, a mountain, maybe. We could see cities spread out below us, lights shining in the darkness. He asked me a simple question, what do you see? Sean paused, looking at his painting again. I told him I saw human creativity, networks of culture and connection, millions of minds working together even when they don't realize it. I told him I saw something worth saving. Jonathan listened intently. He didn't disagree, Sean continued, but he pointed to specific lights, individual homes, individual lives, and said something like, I see people who need to know they matter, not just as a community, but as themselves. Sean's voice grew quieter. The feeling I was left with was that my perspective isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. I've been thinking in systems and movements, but Jesus thought in persons and relationships. Jonathan nodded slowly. That fits with everything we know about him. He dealt with crowds sometimes, but he always saw individuals. He noticed a woman touching his cloak in a pressing throng. He called a tax collector down from a tree by name. That's what's been haunting me. Sean admitted, I've been so focused on our community's future that I sometimes forget to see the individual people right in front of me. He walked to a small table in the corner and picked up a notebook. I've been journaling about this, trying to reconcile my work with this growing sense that there's a dimension to life I've been missing. He handed the notebook to Jonathan, open to a page filled with Sean's handwriting. Asterisk, if consciousness is the universe's way of understanding itself, then love must be consciousness's way of fulfilling itself. The record deals, the fashion lines, the media platforms, these are all just tools. The question is what we're building with them. A future where we achieve more but remain spiritually impoverished, or one where success serves connection, compassion, meaning, asterisk. Jonathan read the words twice, moved by the vulnerability and insight. This is profound, Sean. It's just thoughts in progress, Sean said, taking the notebook back, but watching your portrayal of Jesus, seeing how he connected with people, how he valued them, it's made me question whether I've been defining success too narrowly. He sat down again, facing Jonathan directly. 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference. Someone asked me about my legacy, what I want to be remembered for. I gave my usual answer about uplifting Black culture and creating opportunities. Sean looked down at his hands, but later that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking, if I achieve everything on my list, media empires, cultural influence, generational wealth, but people still don't know how to love each other, what have I really accomplished? Jonathan felt a tightness in his throat. The sincerity in Sean's voice was unmistakable. That's when I decided to reach out to you, Sean continued, not because you're a religious authority, but because you've spent years thinking about how Jesus approached these questions of purpose and meaning. What specific question are you trying to answer? Jonathan asked gently. Sean looked up, his eyes intense. How do I integrate what Jesus said about love and human value with the large-scale work I believe I'm meant to do? I'm not going to stop building businesses or creating platforms. I believe those things matter, but I want them to serve something deeper than just success for its own sake. Jonathan took a deep breath. This conversation had far exceeded his expectations. He was being asked not just about acting technique or scriptural interpretation, but about the integration of faith and purpose at the highest levels of influence. Jesus never asked people to stop being who they were, Jonathan said finally. He asked fishermen to become fishers of men, using their same skills but with a new purpose. He didn't tell the Roman centurion to stop being a soldier. He commended his faith within that role. Sean nodded, listening carefully. Maybe it's not about choosing between business success and spiritual values, Jonathan continued. Maybe it's about infusing one with the other, creating platforms that genuinely serve love, connection, and human dignity rather than replacing them.